Welcome back, survivalists. So over the last 12 months, we've seen a number of devastating and deadly disasters throughout America. From record-breaking forest fires in the western states, leaving many families homeless, to record-breaking hurricanes striking the Gulf Coast, including 2 of them at the same time, to a polar vortex reaching as low as Texas and leaving millions of Texan families without power for multiple days in sub-freezing temperatures. Now, on the surface, these may all seem unconnected, like completely separate scenarios, but in a lot of ways, how you prepare for these scenarios and what mistakes people make during these disaster scenarios are identical. The mistakes that families made in the Gulf Coast after being struck by 2 hurricanes at once are the exact same mistakes that families made in Texas after going 3 days without power in sub-freezing weather. So today I wanted to run through what I think are the 10 biggest mistakes that people make during disaster situations. And unfortunately, many times these mistakes can literally be the difference between life and death. So the first mistake during a disaster situation is not knowing your inventory. One of the first things that you want to do in a disaster situation is assess your inventory and figure out what resources you do and, more importantly, do not have. In Texas, for example, when they got hit by that blizzard and they lost power, one of the first things that you should do is figure out how many blankets do you have, how many batteries in your home do you have, how many flashlights, how many candles do you have, how much food, how much water do you have, and do you have any extra resources that you can share with your neighbors. You also want to know what resources do you wish that you had in case you do get an opportunity to go to a store or talk to your neighbors and you can barter with them for additional resources. In business, there's a saying, what gets measured gets managed. If you don't measure how much inventory you have, you cannot be expected to properly manage your inventory. If you only have 3 days worth of food in your house, that's something that you need to know, and you need to manage your inventory of food. If you only have 6 AA batteries in your entire house, you need to know that, and you need to know that you need to conserve your use of those batteries and use of your flashlights ahead of time. If you don't know how much inventory you have, you won't know what steps to take in order to manage that inventory. Not knowing your inventory is a huge mistake many people make during disaster situations, and they end up squandering resources that they actually had a limited supply of. In just about all disaster scenarios, one of the first things you need to do is assess your situation and take inventory of what resources you do and do not have. The next mistake that people make is panicking, and this is just a natural reaction that humans make when something unexpected happens and they do not have a plan. And when people panic, they make irrational and dumb decisions, and unfortunately, these decisions often lead to them getting themselves killed. Panicking is also what causes people to have a every man for himself mentality and not be concerned about his neighbor's well-being. Panicking is what we saw at the beginning of this pandemic when people would go to the grocery store and literally hoard all of the hand sanitizer and toilet paper that they could fit in their grocery carts, not concerned with the fact that they're not leaving any for the other people in their community. That is because they were panicking and they didn't have a plan and they didn't know what to do, and they just felt like they had to take some sort of action right now. During a disaster situation, you want to slow down, take a deep breath, assess your situation, assess your inventory, and come up with a game plan. Unfortunately, that's not what most people do. Most people simply panic and they get this urge that they need to do something right now. They need to take some sort of action, and this causes them to make irrational decisions that oftentimes can get them killed. The next mistake is being a lone wolf. During a disaster situation, community is key. You don't want to be a lone wolf who isolates themselves to their home. Within a community, you can share resources, and you may be able to get resources that you did not otherwise have. You can help each other out with 2-man jobs. You can keep an eye on each other's properties, which is going to increase your level of security. Let's say a disaster strikes and you take inventory and you have a bunch of candles, but you don't have very many batteries. Well, you can go and talk to your neighbors, and maybe your neighbor has a bunch of batteries but has no candles. You can simply exchange one for the other, and now you're both better off because you're good neighbors. One of the first things that you should do during a disaster situation is simply go and check on all of your immediate neighbors. Simply knock on the door, ask them how they're doing, how they are on resources, if they need help with anything. Now, you don't necessarily need to divulge to them what resources you do and do not have, but kind of feel them out. And if you do have any extra resources that you can provide to them that you don't need, that could serve you later on down the road. Too often in situations like this, we get the impulse to simply barricade ourselves in the home and just ignore everybody else and see everybody else as an enemy. If you go and knock on your neighbor's doors and you kind of establish that communication, that relationship with them, you're going to trigger something in their brains that says that this person is a member of my tribe. And I encourage you to do this with all your neighbors immediately around you. And you start forming that mentality that instead of you against everyone else, it's going to be your tribe against everyone else. And within your tribe, you're going to protect one another and help each other out and share resources within your tribe. During a disaster, you don't want to be a lone wolf. You want to have a tribe, no matter how small or how basic that tribe is. The next mistake that people make during disaster situations is obsessing about the media. Now, during a disaster situation, having access to information can literally be the difference between life and death. Information is crucial. But unfortunately, the culture of our media today, whether that's social media or traditional media, is to focus more on views and ratings rather than providing accurate information. And this often leads to baseless speculations and fear-mongering, which does not do anybody any good during a disaster situation. When 9/11 occurred, I was in high school, and I remember that after 9/11 is when I started watching the news, and I was obsessed. I literally watched the news every single day. I just constantly had it on. For several months there, I was just obsessed with everything that the news was reporting. And unfortunately at the time, a lot of the information that the news had was just wild speculation. And obsessing about the media and consuming information like that does not do anybody any good. Now, unfortunately, consuming media is a very fine line because you do need to have access to valuable information. The information the media provides in terms of weather updates and forecasts can be life savings, but it's just a very fine line, and you want to make sure you don't cross over that line and start consuming too much of the media and start consuming misinformation. The next mistake is bugging out too early. In the prepping community right now, there's a lot of obsessions about bug out bags and bug out plans and bug out locations. But in reality, I'd say about 90% of the disaster situations, bugging out is your absolute last resort and should not be your primary plan. For most situations, your primary plan should be to shelter in place, not to bug out. Your shelter is where you most likely have all of your most valuable resources, whether that's food, water, blankets, a heat source, communication equipment. Many of us have that already within our shelter. And by bugging out and evacuating, you're leaving all of those resources behind, as well as the security of your shelter, and instead just relying on what resources you can carry in a backpack. And this is why I tell people that they should not focus on having a bug out bag and a bug out plan until they first build their shelter in place kit, build their at-home survival kit. This should be your plan A. Bugging out should be the absolute last resort. The next mistake is bragging about your preps. And this can actually occur both before and during a disaster situation. By bragging about your preps and your supplies, you're only asking for trouble, and you're gonna make yourself a target during a disaster situation. People do crazy things during disasters. If we take a look at what we saw in Texas a few weeks ago, people were literally freezing to death in their own homes. Now, if you were a father and you were watching your family suffer and freezing in pitch black darkness day after day after day, and you know that your neighbor down the road has a generator in his garage with extra cans of gasoline, and you don't really like that neighbor all that much, how many people do you think in that situation would be able to justify in their minds breaking into their neighbor's house to steal that generator and gasoline for their families? How many people would tell themselves that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to protect my family? If you're bragging about your preps, you are just asking for trouble, especially if you have resources that the people around you do not have, and those people are watching their families suffer. People do crazy things in disaster situations that they normally would not do. The next mistake is ignoring your health. During disaster situations, even the most mundane and small medical issue can quickly escalate and get out of control. During many disasters, you are under a lot of stress. You're probably dehydrated, you're probably malnourished, and you're probably in a pretty unhygienical situation. All of this will make your immune system much weaker, and make any medical situation much worse. You also need to factor in that you may not have access to medical facilities like you typically do, whether that's from hospitals being overcrowded or just from roads becoming impassable from maybe a hurricane or a blizzard. Even a simple cut can be lethal in a disaster situation if you can't get to the hospital to get an antibiotic. We often take these things for granted in our modern lives. In many disaster situations, your personal hygiene just goes out the window as well. If you're in the Gulf Coast and you just got struck by a major hurricane, and you and your entire family have to go a week without any power or running water or working toilets or working showers, and you're in 80-degree weather, you are just going to be absolutely filthy and disgusting and just a petri dish for various bacteria and viruses. In a situation like that, even the smallest cut on your arm can get out of hand and be lethal if you can't get access to a hospital to get an antibiotic. So when you're in a disaster situation, you really want to pay attention to your health and take extra precautions of maintaining your health and cleaning any wounds that you may have very carefully. So the next mistake is drawing attention to yourself. This is very similar to bragging about your preps. If you have some sort of resource, you don't want to advertise that. You don't want people to know what resources you have. Otherwise, you may turn yourself into a target. There's a concept known as becoming a gray man. And a gray man is somebody who simply blends into a crowd, whatever crowd that may be, and nobody notices them. And because nobody notices them, they don't know what resources they have, and they don't become a target. Now, what valuable resources that you have that you don't want to advertise will change depending on the disaster situation. During a major hurricane, you may not want to advertise to people that you have plenty of clean drinking water for you and your family. During the Texas winter blackouts, you may not want to advertise to everybody that you have a generator and gasoline and candles. During the start of the pandemic, that valuable resource was face masks and hand sanitizer. So during a disaster situation, you just need to be cognizant that you may have resources that other people do not have but really want. And you got to be very cautious about concealing what resources you do and do not have. The next mistake is not having a plan. Now, ideally, you'd have a plan before the disaster strikes, but if you don't have a plan before, that's fine. You can still form a plan during the disaster, even after the disaster strikes. And with many plans, you simply want to ask yourself what if scenarios and figure out the answers to that before that scenario plays out. So what do you do if there's a medical situation? What do you do if you lose power? And what do you do if you lose water? At what point are you going to ask your neighbors for help? At what point are you going to consider bugging out? You also want to take inventory of your resources and come up with a plan for managing that inventory. How much food can you consume daily? How many days worth of food do you have? How much water can you consume before you run out of water? What do you do when you run out of batteries for your flashlight? You want to have answers to all of these situations before the situations actually occur. And you don't necessarily need to write the answers out to all these questions, but in your mind, you loosely want to have an answer to each of these what-if scenarios. The next mistake is becoming complacent. So complacency kills is a common phrase in the military because it literally can be the difference between life and death. But that phrase also really applies to disaster situations. And so what this phrase means is that oftentimes you're very cautious when you first do something, but after you have a few successes at that, you start getting a little smug, a little cocky, and start taking more risk, but expecting the same result. And eventually you're gonna get to a point where you get a very different result. For example, let's say you get struck by a bad hurricane and you don't have any running water and you're forced to boil water in order to purify it. Well, in the first few days, maybe you're really cautious about where you get that water. But after 3-4 days, you may get complacent and get a little lazy, and you start drinking water that you know that you really should not be. That is complacency. You start getting lazy and you're not as disciplined as you were at the start. In disaster situations, you don't want to get complacent, you don't want to get lazy, you don't want to get cocky. So now that you know what the most common mistakes are during a disaster, check out this video I did right here breaking down the 15 items that the Red Cross wants you to keep in your home to be prepared for a disaster. Use these 15 items as the start of your disaster plan. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more prepping and survival videos, and hit that little bell icon to get notified every time I upload a new video. And I'll see you over in the next video.